Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I'm continuing with my discussion on Queen Esther, as codified in the book of Esther in the Hebrew Bible. It's also in the Christian Holy Bible in the Old Testament. So I'm going to just quickly give a quote. The last thing I had talked about was how um, Haman himself, who was the highest king official at the time, who had plotted, he had mounted a gallows, right, to have erected a gallows to have Mordecai, the Jewish cousin of Queen Esther, to be hanged on. It turned out that he himself was hanged, was ordered by the king Xerxes the First, who was the husband of Queen Esther, was ordered to be hanged on the very gallows he'd prepared for his enemy Mordecai, the Jewish official who had saved the king's life, right? So then there was a phrase that I gave. It's actually a quote in the Bible. It's from Proverbs 26, 27. It's so let me read directly. I want to read directly from the Bible. New King James Version. It says, "Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone will have it roll back on him." So that's the New King James Version, right? So that's basically saying that you have to be very careful if you're plotting against people who are righteous, who are favored by God. It will tend to backfire. Christians like to also quote. There's another Bible verse: "Do my prophets no harm." Touch not my anointed, right? Touch not my anointed ones. It tends to backfire, right? So, um, and let me just frame it a little bit more. uh, I want to just give us a frame of reference. And now I'm going to be reading from, because there's another portion, something else I also want to add. It's also still in Proverbs, but I'm going to be reading from the New King James Version, right, of the Bible. And it's Proverbs 26, verse 26, and it explains what happened. So Proverbs chapter 26, verse 26, it says, "Whose hatred is covered by deceit, his wickedness shall be shewed before the whole congregation." So congregation, that just means a large gathering of people, right? So again, whose hatred is covered by deceit, right? So you see people who hate people, right? People full of hatred. They're very deceptive. And you see again, it's a common attribute of nihilists, which is very common in America now, in the world. They're very deceptive. Whose hatred is covered by deceit, his wickedness, and it could be a woman. He is her. The Bible is very masculine, right? It's patriarchal, so they like to use the masculine pronoun. They use it for God as well. Of course, God is not a human being. He's neither masculine nor female, but they use that pronoun, masculine pronoun, for God. So here it goes: "Whose hatred is covered by deceit, his or her wickedness shall be showed before the whole congregation." Right. So, and then it goes again, continues: "Whoso diggeth a pit shall fall therein, and he that rolleth a stone, it will return upon him." And that's exactly what happened to Haman, who had plotted the destruction of Mordecai, simply because Mordecai was a Jew who refused to bow down to him. So after Haman was hanged, a number of events happened. The king ordered for all the 10 sons of all the 10 sons of Haman. Haman had been bragging about his stupendous wealth, his children. He had all these many children. He bragged a lot about his material possessions, right? He was so self-engrossed, so self-absorbed, and he loved these material things, right? And ironically, he lost all these material things. He lost his life, all his 10 sons that he brought, because there was a part in the book of Esther where he had a feast, and he called out his kids and he boasted about all his many children and and all his material possessions. Well, uh, the king ordered the execution of all the 10 sons, right? All the 10 sons of Haman. They were all hanged, right? They were all hanged as well on the gallows with him. They were all killed. And then his material wealth, the king gave it all to Esther to control. So Esther was a queen. So the king asked, Esther and Mordecai. And Mordecai, Esther would reveal uh, to the king that Mordecai was her cousin and she was a Jew as well. So uh, the king, lets Esther and Mordecai to deal with Haman and his co-conspirators, his collaborators, as he wished. They had already given the decree to execute the Jewish people, right? To commit genocide, to annihilate them in the Persian Empire, right? So in all the provinces of the king. So now they were going to reverse all of that. So a number of things happened. But importantly, uh, Queen Esther would give control. She had control of Haman's wealth, his household, his wealth, his treasures that Haman had bragged about when he was alive. And she handed the control over to Mordecai. So there's also something in the Bible, Proverbs 13:22. Let me see from memory, and I can look it up. Proverbs 13:22, it says that the wealth of the wicked is stored up for the righteous, right? The wealth of evildoers, the wealth of the wicked is stored up for evildoers. So this is again what happens. You see what happened that uh, again view the book of Esther as uh, in the framework of a Manichaean conflict between good and evil. So you see the wealth of evildoers, the wealth of the wicked is stored up for the righteous. That's Proverbs 13, verse 22. Let me look for it real quick. And let's see, I'm saying that from memory. I want to see how although I'm going to be cross-referencing in the old, this is the King James, original King James version. So Proverbs, verse 22. So he says, okay, there's a first part to it. But the part I just said, the second part that's Proverbs 13, verse 22 is, the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just, right? So this is what it calls a sinner, same as wicked, synonymous with wicked, the just, synonymous with righteous, right? So the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just, right? That's the second part of Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22. So you see that's sort of what happened. Uh, the wealth of Haman, the wicked, evil person, right, was all laid up and was all transferred to Mordecai, right? It was transferred to the Queen Esther, who transferred it to her cousin Mordecai, so who was a just man, who was viewed as a righteous person. And that's consistent with what it says in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22. The wealth of a sinner is laid up for the just. So, and after that, something else happened, right? Um, the Mordecai would now issue a decree, right? They'd issue letters, and they were given the king's signet, so go to counter the initial decree to execute the Jews. They now issued a counter uh, decree that the Jews were free to execute all those who had plotted against them, the enemies of the Jews, those who were, because they were planning to kill them. So the Jews, executed 500 people initially, and then there was a second time again, they executed 300 people, and then at that time they executed 75,000 people. So literally, the Jews committed genocide in the book of Esther. But again, that was consistent with like the Mosaic doctrine, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, because these people were actually planning to annihilate the Jews. There was a law, but it had nothing to do with the Persians, right? It had nothing to do with the Persians. I wanted to clarify this because there's this stuff circulating on Persians being anti-Semitic against Jewish people. So Persians have historically actually protected Jewish people from Cyrus the Great, and then You see, this is Xerxes the first. His wife was Jewish, and then he issued a decree that Jewish people should actually commit genocide against another people. And this is not anti-Semitic. I'm just referencing the Bible. Against people who had plotted to commit genocide against them. So they're countering it, basically acting in self-defense. So they committed genocide against whom? The Amalekites, right? So again, Agag was an Amalekite, right? So it was those Amalekites that were trying to destroy the Jewish people, because there was already an instruction and order from the time of when the children of Israel were delivered from their bondage in Egypt, and they were attacked by the Amalekites. So, so, and this commemorates. They said after the Jewish people in the Persian Empire in Shushan, right? Shushan, that's Susa. I'm just going to call it Susa because it's also synonymous with Susa, right? They were glad, they celebrated, they feasted, they had banquets, they shared gifts with one another, and they established the feast. That's the origin of the feast of Purim, the feast of Purim, which is still practiced today by the Jewish people. The feast of Purim. That's because when Haman had planned to exterminate the Jewish people, he had cast lots, so they called it to cast lots. So he had cast lots to in order to exterminate the Jewish people, and so he called the Jewish people after they avenged themselves. King, the king of Persia, that's Xerxes, had given them the authority to retaliate or to avenge themselves, forestall their own execution by executing those who planned to annihilate them. They now established the feast of Purim, which is still celebrated today. Now, so we're told that Mordecai was now elevated, and he replaced um, Haman's position, right? Haman had been the highest of the officials. So we're now told at the end that Mordecai became second only to King Xerxes the first, right? And this is recorded in the books and records and chronicles of the Medes and the Persians, right? So and so which is kind of interesting. Now, I also wanted to point out that Mordecai, since his family wasn't discussed, and since he was working with eunuchs, right? He was at the gate, he was a courtier. He was also probably a eunuch, just like Daniel, right? Daniel had been a eunuch, and so this is interesting. Now, Daniel, there are several. Daniel served was in his time as well. He was elevated also to become the highest government official, second only to the king under Darius, after he had survived the plot against him, which threw him into the lion's pit. Right, that was under King Darius, right? King Darius of the Persian Empire. So this is very interesting. You see the intersection of history and what's going on today. In the war, the conflict between U.S. Israel versus Iran. Iran, of course, again, synonymous with Persia, Israel, the old Jewish people, and that's going on. So the United States is a new civilization in the mix. Um, so I think I've pretty much covered the significance of what I wanted to cover. But importantly, I pointed out from the onset that it's not the book of Esther doesn't sanction genocide. That's not what it's doing. It's actually just showing the Manichaean conflict. When I say Manichaean, that's a duality, the conflict between good and evil, good versus evil. And it's interesting, that concept also has its origins amongst the Persians, right? I mentioned how the longest continuing monotheism first monotheism is actually Persian Zoroastrianism. They still practice Zoroastrianism in Persia today, right? In Iran, that's in Iran today. So so you look at the conflict between Mordecai, the Jewish uh, official, versus Haman, the enemy, who was actually an Agagite, that is, an Amalekite, a descendant of Amalekites and a Amalekite. That historic conflict between, so it's symbolizing the Manichaean conflict between good and evil, right? And that's still with us today, right? And so you see it as a, some sort of allegorical and not a sanctioning of genocide. So in the Old Testament, when God said to destroy maybe a people, or to destroy something, it was to destroy evil, right? To make sure that evil doesn't reside with you, right? To destroy evil. Not the focus is not really on the human being. That it's not dehumanizing human beings, but it's just an allegorical depiction. That's how we're supposed to. That's how we view it. As from the perspective of the Christian narrative. My name is Oluro Timiosha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.